everyone. This is kind of an introduction to freshwater invertebrates, and we're going to go through kind of broad taxonomic groups. And in a later lab, we'll get into more fine-scaled and look at families and smaller taxonomic groups. So why are freshwater invertebrates important? I think I've mentioned this in lecture. But there are a huge proportion of organisms that are in freshwater ecosystems. They represent a large portion of biodiversity. They're also really good bioindicators, so they're readily available to sample most times of the year. It's pretty easy and cheap to sample them. If you have a net and something to put them in, like a jar, you can sample aquatic invertebrates. They vary a lot in tolerance to chemicals, sediments, and oxygen concentrations, which means that when you find certain aquatic invertebrates, that might mean that it's a very pristine chemical, low anthropogenic chemical water with high oxygen, or it might tell you something about sedimentation, like there's too much sediment in a stream. It might tell you that there's only organisms that are very tolerant to things, and that might mean that the water has been impaired by some kind of pollution or some kind of disturbance. So by looking at what types of invertebrates are in different places, we can learn a lot about those places without having to analyze the water for 100 different chemicals or something like that. So I just wanted to briefly go over, we're going to focus today on class and order, but we will talk about the phylum. So everything is going to be in the kingdom Animalia, but we'll have a couple of phyla, a few different classes, and then another time we will focus on orders. And today we'll do orders, but next time we'll do families. I won't ever expect you to know the genus or the species, for example. So we're going to be focused on kind of these levels: phyla, class, order, family. So this is what we're doing today: class and order. So macroinvertebrates, what does that mean? It means that macro means they're large enough to see. So you can see that they're there and get some of the characteristics without using a microscope. If they're really small, like a couple of millimeters or even 5 millimeters, it's going to be difficult to look at things that are on their legs or their mouth parts, things like that. You're going to need a dissecting microscope to look at that. But you can see the general body shape and the big features, which often can get you to order without the microscope. Most of the time, if you want to go to family, you're probably going to want a microscope. And so normally in this class, we would be going out and getting insects and bringing them back to the lab and looking at them through the microscope. We're just going to be looking at really good photographs in the virtual lab. And so it'll be enough to identify them with these good photographs. So there are 4 phyla of invertebrates that are found in freshwater. One is the platyhelminths, or the flatworms. They're annelids, which are segmented worms. This includes leeches and actual worms. Mollusks include snails, mussels, and clams. And arthropods include insects, mites, crayfish, and roly-polies. And there is an aquatic version of the roly-poly. So the first one is flatworms. The phylum Platyhelminths. Class is Turbellaria. And these are just flat, long worms. They're called flatworms. They're flat. So they have 2 sides. You can turn them over. They're not round like the other worms. And they have these 2 distinct kind of eye things on the front. They don't have any segmentation. They don't have any special features. There's about 200 different species living in freshwater in North America. But you only need to know this. If you can tell me that they're from phylum Platyhelminths and class Turbellaria, and you can tell me that that's what this is, then you're good to go. Leeches, so we're moving on to the phylum Annelida, or the annelids, which are segmented worms. So that's what makes them different than the flatworms. Leeches are in the class Hirundinea, and they have regularly spaced segments. And you guys probably have some idea of what leeches are. So they have two suckers. There's one on each end, and probably if you picked up something that was segmented with suckers, you probably would have guessed it's a leech. So you're probably going to be okay with these. They vary a lot in size. They can be only 4 millimeters. They can be 450 millimeters. That's a big leech. Most of them live in still or slow moving water. There are 69 species in North America. They're really hard to identify. I refuse to do it because it's really a pain in the butt. And it doesn't usually matter to me what species of leech. It doesn't tell you a lot about the aquatic environment. Now, if you think leeches are cool and you want to learn how to identify them, by all means, go for it. But I will not be able to help you with that. So you only need to know the phylum and the class. So if you can tell me that they're annelids and that they're in Hirundinea, then you're going to be good to go with leeches. I will note a lot of people are freaked out by leeches. There are some parasitic leeches that are in fresh waters. Most of them are actually predators. So they're just eating other things. They're not wanting to latch onto you. Though I will say I have waded into ponds before and come out with leeches attached to my legs. So it does happen. They can be variable in color, but you can see the suckers really well here. So they usually have one big sucker on the fat end and one smaller sucker on the skinnier end. And so you can see that here. Posterior sucker is the big one, and it's actually the mouth on the front end with jaws. As I said, they vary in color. So like here's a very small one, here's a bigger one. They can have really cool patterns. These are actually baby leeches attached underneath an adult leech. So that's kind of interesting when you find that. All right, the next group are aquatic earthworms. These are also in the phylum Annelida, like the leeches, but it's a different class. It's the Oligochaeta, and if you've taken marine biology, you've probably come across Oligochaeta before because there are marine ones as well. They have regularly spaced segments, so you can see here the segments all along the worm. I mean, you guys are all familiar with terrestrial earthworms. These are just different species that live in water. They don't have any suckers. They're usually between 1 and 30 millimeters, and there's 170 freshwater species in North America. Most of the time they're found in ponds or slow-moving water. So if you're in a river or a fast-moving stream, you're probably not going to get these guys. And for these guys, you only need to know phylum and class. So Annelid, Oligochaeta. Next up is snails. So we're moving on to the phylum Mollusca, or the mollusks. And snails are in the class Gastropoda. So they have a spiral shell or cone. You're probably going to get at least this class pretty easily because most of you know what a snail looks like. In freshwater systems, we get snails that look like this. We also have snails that have a point, but they all have a spiral. Though some of them are flat. So the ones that you're going to get right away have this distinct spiral. These guys do not, but we will talk about them some more. There are 15 different families. We're going to learn, I think, 3 or 4 of them. There are 500 species in North America, which is a lot. But they're not found in fast-moving water. So they're really common in ponds. Usually they're eating algae, and they're really important grazers in ponds and wetlands. So the next class, also in mollusca, so these are also mollusks, are mussels and clams. And these are bivalves. So the class is Bivalvia, which means that they have a 2-hinged shell. And so these are anything that you would normally think of like a clam or a mussel that opens up and the 2 shells will be attached at one point. There are 4 families and 270 species in North America, and they're found in most freshwater habitats, and we will learn some families. Freshwater mussels are really, really important, and it turns out that we live in a biodiversity hotspot for freshwater mussels. We're not exactly the hotspot, but we're part of it. The highest diversity is probably in kind of the Tennessee, southern Kentucky area. So you can see it gets, sorry, this is so pixelated, but we have more species of freshwater mussels in the southeastern United States than anywhere else in the world. There are other places that have quite a few species, and that'll be southern and southeastern Asia, the Amazon basin, and then us. That's basically the 3 places where the most species are found. And freshwater mussels are declining very rapidly. They're a group of severe conservation concern. They're super interesting, and we'll learn more about them later on. But I wanted to mainly point out the biodiversity here. All right, so I will pause there.